I wanted to begin by reflecting on what Andrew Marr said at the beginning of his Sunday morning programme on the BBC. He spoke directly to the camera and attempted to frame the turbulent recent political events to aid the understanding of his viewers, and said, there is a logic to leaving the EU. We could choose to become a radically different country, lower taxes, less regulation, and there's a logic for staying if we want to stick with the essentially social democratic European model we have followed for the last 45 years. Underneath the shouting, it's about which way Britain goes next, and maybe that's why everyone sounds so frantic. And of course, Marr would only add to the frantic tone of the debate later in the programme when he disgracefully accused Shami Chakrabarti of patronising him in what was a bizarre and aggressive outburst. But there is a lot else wrong with what Andrew Marr said on the programme. His characterisation of the last 45 years as an era of social democracy is an unusual and unorthodox interpretation, and is a surprising statement from someone who has written and presented a BBC history of modern Britain. And I, for one, was not aware that I'd been living through a golden era of social democracy. But perhaps the most troubling thing about Marr's analysis is that even 2.5 years after the referendum, he still sees leaving the EU as being purely a deregulatory, laissez-faire, small-state, right-wing project. He seems to assume that 17.4 million people share an identical world with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Heaven forbid. And Marr does not even countenance the idea that the EU itself curtails the ability of a government to regulate markets or to intervene and invest in the economy. He still equates Europe with social democracy despite years of neoliberal policies across the continent. And he's clearly not kept up with what our panellists tonight have been saying and writing. Marr frames the choice between the nation as being between a social democratic status quo or a turbocharged Thatcherism if we distance ourselves from the EU. That is a flawed analysis, but it is also deeply pessimistic and highly dangerous. My great concern is that this type of framing has an influence on the debate, and that it sometimes influences the left of the Labour Party. If we follow Marr's thinking, it puts us in the position of defending the status quo, telling the working class that things can only get worse and that they should be grateful for the little that they have. It puts us in opposition to the popular will of the public and the expressed views of millions of people who have suffered under the policies of the last 45 years. Some, as Mick has already said, have never even voted before the referendum. And it puts us at risk of alienating the very people we need to mobilise, when Labour needs to be a party of popular mobilisation and radical change. It puts us in the position of trying to keep the UK embedded in the EU institutions. It limits our ability to coherently put forward a radical and transformative programme for government. And it also puts us in a position where we end up parroting the warnings from the CEOs of multinational companies of impending economic disaster. But perhaps worst of all, if the left and the Labour Party retreat into soft Brexitism or continue calls for another referendum, we are helping to create an environment where the far right can thrive. Yeah. The left and the Labour Party need to be positive about democracy, positive about the future of the country, and positive about leaving the EU. And I think a problem for Labour this past week has been Keir Starmer's 6 tests. They're all about keeping the UK close to the EU. They're about preserving existing perceived benefits of EU membership. None of the tests are framed positively in terms of ensuring that the deal leaves the UK free to act outside of the constraints and requirements of the single market and customs union membership. Labour has been right to reject May's withdrawal agreement with the EU, but sometimes been wrong about the reasons it's given as to why it should be rejected. Some Labour politicians have said May's deal should be rejected because it doesn't involve a permanent customs union, or because it doesn't guarantee a long-term future of prosperity. But how could it? There's a danger that these sound like rehashed arguments from the referendum debate and position Labour as being against leave at all. May's deal is a bad deal because it moves us too far away. It's a bad deal not because it moves us too far away from the EU. It's a bad deal because it continues to bind the UK to pro-market EU rules. And here are 3 things that Labour and the left should be looking to achieve. Firstly, the UK government will not be covered by state aid rules so that it can intervene in markets to protect and further the interests of workers. And to be fair, Jeremy Corbyn has talked about this, but we do need to hear more. Secondly, the UK government has the power to demarketise our public services. The UK government should take control of whether sectors are open to competition or not. That means no more EU procurement rules and no more pressure from the EU to marketise sectors like rail and post. There should be no barriers to the UK government shutting down existing markets. And thirdly, that the UK should no longer be the subject to the ECJ's Almo Herring decision, which means that workers are transferred out of the public sector and then not covered by subsequent pay awards. And it's not really surprising that the agreement reached between the Conservatives from the UK and the Conservatives from the EU is very far from a people's Brexit. It does not mean a clean break from the EU state aid rules, procurement rules and anti-worker ECJ rulings. We should be pressing for the benefits to the UK working class of being free of the EU to be realised at 11 p.m. on March the 29th, 2019. And we should be very wary of those who are trying to shift Labour's position on Europe towards having a second referendum. And we should look carefully at the motives of the likes of Chris Leslie and Chuka Umunna. We also need to be wary of the approaches of the SNP, the Liberals and the Greens. Our members in public service know what market pressures are all about. They mean attacks on terms and conditions, skimping on service quality, they mean job cuts, increasing workloads, they mean two-tier workforces and the fragmentation of our public sector. They mean all the inefficiency of wasteful advertising and tendering processes. We want properly planned public services that are subject to democratic control, that are delivered by the public sector, and we should not accept any impediment from the EU to us achieving that vision, comrades. So what I want to see is a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn with the mandate for and the ability to implement a radical economic programme. That would mean more spending on public services, more of our public services being delivered by the public sector, and turning back the tide of privatisation and outsourcing. A post-Brexit deal with the EU that keeps us tied to its pro-market rules and maybe even part of its single market could make all of that impossible. And it would certainly make it a lot harder. So what we need, comrades, is Brexit. Not a Brexit that fits with Andrew Marr's analysis. Not a Brexit on Rees-Mogg's terms or on Theresa May's terms, but a true people's Brexit that paves the way for a more democratic, more equal and fairer UK.